What has the pandemic taught us so far about cruising? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is Tips for Travellers. Whether you love cruising or you loathe cruising, the lockdown and the last months have taught us an enormous amount about cruising. Why did cruising become such a poster child of coronavirus? And did cruise lines need to dispose of some of their fleets? And what the big money really thinks about the future of cruising? Let's explore the 5 big learnings that I think we've got about cruising so far through the pandemic. One of the biggest learnings that we got is that cruising and cruise lines have very few influential and important friends. That includes governments, that includes health authorities, that includes the media, and even states and countries which have an enormous and really important cruising business going through there, like Florida or even Spain. They have certainly turned their back on cruising and been quite hostile to cruising. Now, cruisers and cruise lovers have got very upset about the lack of support and the lack of friends and influence. However, I think there are a number of critical things that have created that. First of all, the cruise lines are flying as flags of convenience. So they are genuinely the big cruise companies, the 3 really big cruise companies, Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian Cruise Line. They don't have their head office and they're not incorporated in one of the big countries like the United States. So they're registered offshore, or their ships are registered offshore. So they're not seen as a fundamental part of any of these big countries. Also, really importantly, that also means because of the way that they recruit people, although they do obviously employ a lot of people in countries like the United States, the UK, and so on, but most of the people who work on the ships are seen as foreign. So they're not seen as being a fundamental part of the countries they operate in, even though they are really big companies. Secondly, and linked to that, is they're seen as entirely recreational and not strategic. So when you look at the airlines, for example, they're seen as really fundamental and strategic, not only because they are seen as being one of the companies, the registered domiciled in a particular country, but they're also seen as fundamental for moving cargo around, for building business links, for connecting families, for opening up access to out-of-the-way places. So airlines are seen as fundamentally and strategic, whereas cruise lines are seen as just recreational, they are discretionary, and there's a certain amount of snobbery around it because cruises are actually still seen as being a kind of a luxury thing, even though we know there's a wide range of cruises. So they're also not seen as strategic and fundamental, so they're not seen as being really important to defend or look after to the same degree. One of the really important reasons that they don't have friends is they're seen as a drain on resources. Certainly when the lockdown started, there was cruise ships all around the world trying to get into ports. They were looking for help from the maritime authorities, maybe from the health authorities, to try and help repatriate people off the ships. So they were seen as a real potential drain on the resources of a particular state. Of course, then linked to that, they are not that good for the environment. They also create lots of noise and people and over-tourism. So there's a sense also that from that perspective, they're not great. What's really interesting though is if you look at countries where they do have cruising companies which are either incorporated in that place or have major operations, we've seen a very different approach. So let's take a look at Norway, for example. Hurtigruten and Sea Dream, which are both Norwegian owned, they were one of the first to be allowed to get back into some form of cruising. In Germany, where TUI is a massive big travel company in Germany, they have a joint venture with cruising. So they have Mein Schiff Cruise Line, they have Hapag-Lloyd. Again, they were allowed to start up really early. MSC Cruises is owned by an Italian family based out of Switzerland, but again, very strong links with the Italian economy. They have a huge cargo operation which operates out of Italy. They are seen as really, really fundamental. And again, we saw the Italian government being very keen and open to letting them start. In France, you have Ponant, which is a French-owned company, again, being allowed to start up. So where you've seen those companies which have a strong root, they are opening up and were allowed to open up much more. The second thing that we learned about cruising is that it was seen as the poster child. It's seen to represent a lot of things that coronavirus is and it stands for. But again, I think there's a really good reason why that happened. At the time the Diamond Princess outbreak happened, where there was that big spread through the ship, it was quarantined in Japan, there was huge press focus on it. That was the only really major outbreak of COVID-19 that affected Western people and Western businesses. Up until then, it had been seen a problem that was happening in Asia. It was bubbling up in China, Vietnam, Cambodia, wherever. That then followed on with things like Ruby Princess in Australia. We then had all those ships sailing around the world with Western passengers trying to find ports of call, being turned away all through South America, all around the world, eventually having to head into the United States. It is very frustrating for many people that the cruise industry was seen as, and still seen as, such a major issue when it comes to coronavirus. When you look at the spread of coronavirus around the world, it's very clear that cruising could not possibly have been the cause of its rapid spread. It must have come through people, for example, flying around the world and bringing it from one country to the next and spreading it, if you just look at the way it spread. However, the airlines never were seen as the flashpoint for coronavirus. The airlines have never been as intimately associated with coronavirus, although actually practically, which drives people who are big pro cruisers, drives them actually crazy and frustrates them, is the cruise industry didn't necessarily spread coronavirus around a lot, other than potentially, you could argue, in Australia, but it did seem as a flashpoint, and it really was the symbol of travel that made coronavirus so tangible for many people. Also, what's important to bear in mind is another reason that it became such a poster child is not only was it early outbreaks, and that floating petri dish was a very dramatic term was coined, but it made for very good stories. People were stuck on ships for long periods of time. The media was able to have lots of imagery around it. They were able to focus on it. They were able to tell the stories of the people involved. They could track the whole story of people. So actually, from a storytelling point of view, it became a really powerful symbol, whereas people are on aircraft and they disappear all over the place. We see that, of course, in the countries that we live. If there's an outbreak in a pub or even in a factory, it becomes a fact rather than a story. And I think that's another reason why cruising has become such a big focal point for, as a poster child for coronavirus. It's also important to note that as startup cruises have started, the media have made an enormous story around the outbreaks. However, there has only been, as cruises started up, one true outbreak, which was on Hurtigruten and Roland Amundsen, where they didn't follow the right procedures and protocols for quarantining crew, and there was a genuine outbreak on board the ship. However, all the other reported things like Sea Dream, Uncruise, Paul Gauguin, that was actually a case of protocols working, where one guest, either who'd been on the cruise previously or was on the cruise, was picked up as having a positive test, and they were able to be isolated, taken off the ship, and everyone was tested, everyone was fine. But the media have reported this whole wave of COVID outbreaks. The same thing doesn't happen, of course, if one person is positive in a pub or any other kind of situation. The next thing that we learned, which I found is really interesting, is whilst there's the doom and gloom around the money, certainly believes there is a lot of potential in cruising. There was lots of talk as the lockdown started that cruise companies were going to go bust, they were all going to go to the wall. Now, at the time of recording, they haven't sailed for nearly 6 months or so, and it's very unlikely, the way things are heading, that they're probably going to be cruising anytime this year, or certainly, if they're very lucky, towards the end of the year in any form or fashion. However, they have raised an enormous amount of money from either new investors, in the case of Carnival, where the Saudis came in and took a big chunk of it, or from loans and other kind of fundraising. They're burning through, now that they've dialed back the ships in cold storage, between $150 million and $250 million every single month. But they have raised enough money to be cruising for a good 9 months to a year longer with no cruising. So certainly the financial industry, the investors, see an enormous potential in cruising. So whilst a lot of people are losing faith in cruising, the long-term future, where the money are placing their bets, is very pro-cruising. And I think that's a big learning, is that people, when they look at the longer term, see the future of cruising. The other thing that I think we learned is that the cruise lines, because there was so much demand, were actually running quite a lot of unprofitable or borderline profitable ships. So we saw, as the lockdown happened, that cruise lines started to get rid of the less efficient parts of their fleet. The most significant of those was Carnival. They got rid of almost 10% of their fleet. They got rid of 13 ships, either by sending those for scrap or selling those on. Royal Caribbean haven't sold any of their core brands, but Pullman Tour, which was another joint venture which had a couple of ships, those ships have gone and been basically broken up, or in the process of being broken up. What's very important, though, is we haven't seen, as people had predicted, big bankruptcies, and that ships and cruise lines were going to disappear. There have probably only been two really key ones, one of which was Pullman Tour, the one that I've already mentioned, although that as a brand name still survives. And then Cruise and Maritime Voyages, based out of the UK, they did go bankrupt. There's been some other very small individual ones, but none of the key major ones have gone bankrupt. Crystal Holding Company is doing some financial reconfiguring, but are really clear that that is going to keep on sailing. We haven't seen the massive contraction, certainly at this point of time, that people had predicted in cruising. There's been a bit of shedding because they were inefficient ships, but they ditched all the unprofitable ships very early on. The next key thing that I think we learned is that cruising is going to take time to return. We've seen as cruising have started again in Europe, the demand hasn't been perhaps as robust as many people had thought it would be. Although they're saying with 60 to 70% capacity, MSC Cruises have postponed bringing a second ship back into service because demand has been relatively weak. So demand hasn't been massively huge. So I think we're going to see it's going to take some time for people to get the confidence to move back into cruising. I've done a whole other video where I've looked at the reasons that people aren't coming back so quickly. But one of the key stumbling blocks for people who love cruising is many of the protocols that are being required to get cruising back and up and running is not creating the kind of vacation experience that people love cruising for. So that's going to be a challenge over time, is marrying protocols that are safe enough to get cruising sailing again with creating an environment on board that people really want to embrace and spend their money on. And you can go and watch that video if you want to find out more about that. So far in the pandemic, we've learned a load of things about cruising. Cruise lovers and cruise haters have really strong perspectives. What I've tried to do is take a look in a slightly more balanced way, I think anyway, at what we've really learned about cruising. I have loads more videos of cruise updates, cruise tips and advice. So why don't you watch another one of those right now?